thanks to all of you who have joined us today, this incredibly important and admittedly somewhat solemn Fighting Hate from Home. As you all know, yesterday marked a year since the soul-shattering massacre in southern Israel. Hamas terrorists butchered, mutilated, slaughtered more than 1,200 individuals and kidnapped 250 innocents, stealing them into Gaza. The attack shook all of us at ADL, the Jewish people in diaspora, and really the entire world to the core, leaving a devastating impact on Israel and the world as we know it. October 8th, 2023, the day after that horrific event, is really an anniversary of the day when we began to cope with the new reality, a sad and sobering reality filled with unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism. In this moment, Jews everywhere feel a level of threat and a lack of safety that would have seemed unimaginable pre-10/7. Let me share some staggering numbers here today that we just released yesterday on the anniversary. We found that the U.S. Jewish community has faced more than 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents since 10/7. That's a 200% increase over the same period of time in the previous year. You'll hear more about this number and the data beneath it today from Oren Segal, Vice President of the ADL Center on Extremism. But just to put it in some perspective, that number, 10,000 plus, is the highest total we've ever seen in a 12-month period since ADL started tracking this information in the 1970s. And it comes on top of a nearly 900% increase in incidents over the past decade. On campus, that we all know was a problem, the issues were even more severe. We recorded a nearly 500% increase year over year between the academic year of 23-24 and the previous one. A nearly 500% increase, it is completely unacceptable. And this isn't some abstract issue. I'm guaranteeing that everyone watching this Zoom can relate that this is a deeply personal issue. All of us know someone who's been affected. Maybe it's an observant Jewish person who now covers his kippah with a baseball cap when he's out in public. Maybe it's a college student that you know who hides her connection to the Jewish homeland in order to pass a class or maintain her friend group. Or it's Jewish professionals, authors, therapists, chefs, investors, journalists, actors, and so on, who have been targeted as Zionists and bullied, not just by activists, but by their peers in their industry. While the Jewish community certainly bears the brunt of anti-Semitism, let's keep in mind that we know it is a contagion, it is a virus, and it will ultimately infect and endanger not just the Jewish community, but all of society. Indeed, the forces mounted against the American Jewish community are mounted against America itself. If we fail to stamp out anti-Jewish hate now, I believe it will fraction the very foundation of our country. I think they're already trying to do that. At ADL, we are fighting back with a full court press in the halls of Congress, in the courts, in the court of public opinion, using every lever within our reach to challenge this intensifying animus against the Jewish people. And it will take all of us. It requires each and every one of us in order to fight this battle and to win. It's going to demand of us that we take risks. It's already created the conditions in which we know we've got to innovate, we've got to experiment, we've got to try more stuff if we hope to beat this back once and for all. And so today on this unique webinar, you're going to hear from a range of speakers who are committed to that fight, people who are working with us inside or outside ADL, but on the front lines of fighting hate for good. So now I'd like to welcome our esteemed speakers, beginning with our special guest, Eitan Bernath, who's a chef, an author, and an activist. Susan Heller Pinto, who's our Vice President for International Policy at ADL. Oren Segal, who, as I mentioned, is ADL Vice President of our Center on Extremism. And David Goldenberg, who's the ADL Regional Director of our Midwest office based out in Chicago. He covers a range of states in the central United States. So without any further ado, we'll just jump right in, and let me start with Eitan. If I might, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about, as someone who has really just built an incredible following and a remarkable presence on social media, what have you noticed about the rise of anti-Semitism on social media since 10/7, and how have you responded to this phenomenon, Eitan?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the question. I've been, for context, creating content on the internet since I was 11 years old. I'm 22 now. It's been more of my life now than it hasn't, or I guess just about equal. And, you know, anti-Semitism is something that I've definitely always experienced online. You know, unfortunately, it's just part of being a Jew in general in life, but especially being a Jew on the internet. But since October 7th, it has grown to my mom's a math teacher, so beyond exponential growth, like explosively exponential growth. And in the months directly following October 7th, you know, I was very vocal immediately. My brother was in Israel at the time when October 7th happened. Luckily, he was fine, far away from where most of the action was. But I was very vocal about it, and I received hundreds of very specific death threats. Across, whether it's in comments, direct messages, emails, publicly posted death threats, and I didn't leave my apartment for weeks on end. If I did, I had armed security. I don't walk around at night even still, but if I'm by myself in the city anymore. It has real world effects.
Really sorry to hear that. I'd love to think about, you know, how you engage with your followers on these issues. I'm going to guess a lot of the people who follow you, didn't know you were Jewish. They don't come at this as sort of hardcore haters. So there's such a wide range of opinions. How do you engage on this online and engage with, again, the people who follow you and look to you for leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there's different subsets of people. I have part of my audience that is Jewish, that, you know, is going through the similar things that I am. You know, there's the people that followed me maybe because they saw one video of mine somehow before October 7th, maybe didn't know that I was Jewish, even though I don't know how you didn't know. My name's Eitan, but I talk about being Jewish quite a bit, who were like, you know, on October 7th and following it when I was posting about it, were like, oh, I hate Jews, and I you know, all Jews should die, all Zionists should die, who unfollowed me, who wrote those messages. And then I'd say there was the middle ground of, you know, there were people that don't have an opinion, and then kind of closely next to them, there are people who, you know, are maybe highly critical of Israel, but don't go as far as, you know, calling for the destruction of Israel, and people, you know, who support and who are not Jewish, but, you know, just care about their fellow Jews and about, you know, basic human decency to understand how horrific October 7th was. And so it was very interesting. I think for me, I try to approach everything from a sense of empathy and understanding, and that, you know, I think I like to hope that most people, you know, the media is very biased against Israel, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so I've actually found that there's more people out there than you would think that are maybe have a negative view of Israel, or a negative view, probably not a negative view of Jews that you could change, but definitely a negative view of Israel, that are open to learning about that what they may have heard or seen or read is not true information.
Interesting. Well, I mean, look, I think, Eitan, you're an important voice. I think you're a voice that means a lot to a lot of people. So I appreciate what you're doing. I'm going to come back to you, but I'd like to turn, if I might, to Susan Heller Pinto from the ADL team. Susan, what have we heard about what happened in the United States? I mean, what we've heard about what happened in the United States is well known, but what challenges outside of America are Jews confronting? Can you talk about how anti-Semitism is manifesting globally in different countries, different regions of the world? I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure, Jonathan. Thanks for the question. So, as you know, for decades, every time there have been tensions in the Middle East, we've seen a growth and increase in anti-Semitic attacks, particularly taking place in Europe. We saw this in 2006, in 2014, and also in 2021. But we've not experienced anything as the explosion of anti-Jewish hate that was unleashed worldwide since following the Hamas attack on October 7th. To use Eitan's word, it was really an exponential increase that was almost instantaneous. So we have the data from Jewish communities around the world and what they've been confronting. So France, for example, for the first 3 months following October 7th, 2023, there was a 1,000% increase in anti-Semitic incidents. In Australia, the same period, 738% increase. In Austria, 500%. In Brazil, over the course of 2023 over 2022, there was a 311% increase. This, I could go on and on. This is what's happening in Jewish communities worldwide. And it's manifesting in attacks on various different Jewish targets. We've seen horrifying attacks on synagogues. For example, in Tunisia, anti-Israel rioters vandalized and burned down a historic synagogue. Jewish institutions have been targeted. In Montreal, Canada, there have been several incidents of bullets fired at Jewish schools or a Molotov cocktail thrown at a Jewish community center. Jews have even had their homes targeted. In Belgium, a home of an elderly Holocaust survivor was vandalized with the words "Free Gaza" and a swastika. Jonathan, I do want to be clear that Jewish communities around the world are strong, they're vibrant, they're resilient, and that has also been on display since October 7th of 2023. But at the same time, most communities around the world are confronting daily incidents of anti-Semitism, leaving them in many cases feeling isolated and vulnerable.
Yeah, how have governments responded? I mean, we talk about vandalism on a Holocaust survivor's home, which is so despicable. I mean, it makes me want to throw up. But talk a little bit about how the governments, local or national, are stepping up when their citizens, their Jewish citizens in particular, are being marginalized and threatened in this way.
So we're seeing really a range, really across the board. There are a lot of countries that have strongly and consistently condemned anti-Semitism and are providing strong support for their Jewish community, both at the national and local level, including through law enforcement, through the courts, through education. We see this in Germany, in Argentina, in Australia. Other countries are more passive, and their response to hate is sometimes strong and sometimes not. Their support for the Jewish community, it depends. It depends on the incident and on the situation. We see this in a country like Peru, perhaps, or the Netherlands. And on the other side, there are some countries that are truly passive or even permissive in their lack of response to anti-Semitism. Examples of this could be Belgium, Chile, or Ireland. And I want to also say that there are certain countries where the government policies that are explicitly anti-Zionist, explicitly pro-Hamas, these policies and statements by government leaders have emboldened an environment where anti-Semitism can be freely expressed. We see this in countries like Turkey and South Africa, where it has a real impact on those Jewish communities.
Wow, it's really quite stunning, Susan. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think all of us are coping with what this means, and it's frightening to hear about this tsunami. I think nowhere has it been more pronounced than in the United States, where ADL focused most of our resources. So let me shift over to Oren. You know, we released new data yesterday, this about the 10,000 plus incidents that we saw over the past 12 months since 10/7. Can you elaborate a little bit on the 10,000 number? Talk about how the data is collected. Talk about, double click, if you will, about what the numbers mean, and then we can then talk about extremism.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first of all, 10,000, this 10,000 number, it's shocking, but it's also preliminary, right? We continue to receive and review reports during that time frame of that report from our 25 regional offices and people around the country. So the final number is actually still TBD. Jonathan, I've never seen anything like this, but the data quantifies what, so many people in the Jewish community have been feeling and experiencing, right? It explains why the Jewish community feels vulnerable. So of that 10,000, right, so far, nearly 8,000 included verbal or written harassment, 2,000 acts of vandalism, perhaps most disturbing, 150 assaults, physical assaults that have been reported to us. These are just sobering numbers no matter how you look at it. But the actual activity that these numbers represent are frankly even perhaps more alarming. So if you look at the 12,000 plus incidents targeting Jewish students on campus, which by the way is a 500% increase from the same time frame the prior year, you see that centers of Jewish life, such as Hillel's and Chabad's, are becoming the frequent target of this anti-Israel activity. Harassment, vandalism, calls for the expulsion over the course of this year. And we at COE, we read through the demands of over 130 organizers of these encampments, and very closely, and saw what they were actually asking for. If they got what they wanted, it would change Jewish life on campus, right? In addition, there's 2,000 plus incidents targeting Jewish institutions during this time frame. Now, half of those are bomb threats. Bomb threats and swatting have become, frankly, part of the day-to-day activities that institutions need to prepare themselves for. But some of those were also protests, blaming all Jews for the policies of the Israeli government or military policy. Similarly, we've seen elected officials, journalists, business leaders at their businesses being targeted for Israel's actions and the country's war against Hamas. I mean, in some ways, by targeting these specifically Jewish institutions, it's an example of classic anti-Semitism. Now, this data doesn't, merely reveal a trend that we are seeing, and it does, but it reveals, a crisis. These numbers are sobering. The activities that they represent are alarming. And if I may, just kind of one more point on this, looking at these activities for many years, perhaps the most alarming to me is the explicit support that we're seeing of terrorist organizations at these protests and at these rallies, right? While praise for Hamas and celebrations of the attack began literally immediately after it occurred, we continue to see Hamas and Hezbollah and PFLP flags around the country, even Houthi flags. As we saw yesterday, as part of the start of this day of rage, event organizers have characterized the attacks as a guiding light or as a historic act of resistance. I mean, this brazen support for terror is something that we've never seen before. And frankly, it's part of a broader denial of Jewish suffering, right? This was particularly acute for me when I started seeing the posters of kidnapped children being torn down all over the country. Jonathan, I spend a lot of time in very dark spaces. I mean, that is my job, but I still can't wrap my head around that type of depravity. So the last comment on this is, we know that glorifying terrorists and their actions is morally indefensible. The problem with many of the anti-Semitic incidents that we've tracked is that rhetoric could potentially also inspire more.
So I want to double click on the kind of extremist element behind this. So you talked about the fact that for the first time we're seeing this explicit support for terror groups. You're talking about the fact that we're seeing it spread all over the country. Like, to what do you attribute this? What feels different to you now than before in terms of the causality of this? And what do we take away in terms of the broader trend vis-a-vis kind of extremist movements?
Yeah, I mean, in the past, we have seen examples of support for terror, whether it was Hamas, Hezbollah, or some other group. It just wasn't at this level. It was almost outliers within sort of these broader protests. At least they were more quiet about it. But the fact that now it's like a common feature that sort of Israeli lives, Jewish lives are, not seen as, relevant to the discussion, that it's justified, legitimized. I mean, why that is, maybe because some of the, narratives that we are tracking about the conflict are in online spaces, right? And, if you want to get nuance to a subject, you probably don't want to go to TikTok or some other social media platform. But I think a lot of people are getting their news. I mean, there was one study recently that I think 43% of 18-year-olds and younger get their news from TikTok. I mean, that's not the place necessarily to get the news, but we also know people are spending a lot of time creating disinformation in order to intentionally confuse people and to prey upon them and to spread their hatred. Well, one last thing on this, when you look at sort of the extremes, we also have to recognize that the weaponization of anti-Zionism and the normalization of sort of anti-Semitism more broadly has animated all sorts of extremists, right? I mean, there was a conference this summer that we exposed at ADL called, by the way, the Jewish Problem Conference. It doesn't get any more sort of on the nose than that, but that it included Muslim extremists, black separatists, Holocaust deniers, white supremacists. I mean, I think that the idea that, you can cloak your anti-Semitism in anti sort of Israel rhetoric, in some ways they think makes it more palatable for the masses, maybe allows them to more easily evade content moderation online, right? There's a tactical element to this. And anyway, those are some of the reasons why I think maybe people are more willing to be sort of explicit, certainly with their anti-Zionism and general anti-Israel activity, but also just kind of in the context of they don't view support for terror the way people should be viewing support for terror.
Yeah, I'm going to go to David in a moment, but I just have one last question. Oren, you've been doing this for a long time, right? As you alluded to, and you spend a lot of time in dark spaces.
Indeed.
So I'm curious, why do you think this has happened now? What makes this moment different than what we saw in the past? Because there were previous, Israeli conflicts in the region. There were previous, we dealt with them together, previous spurts of very public instances of anti-Semitism in the United States, Jersey City, Poway, Pittsburgh, Charlottesville, et cetera, in recent years, Colleyville. But what makes this moment so different where it feels like we've kind of crossed a Rubicon? What do you think what's about it? Why is this so unique?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that was spontaneous. I think for many folks, seeing the anti-Semitism across the ideological spectrum, but certainly on college campuses and in the sort of broader anti-Zionist movement was a surprise. But we know it has been there, and it was not a spontaneous reaction. If I had the exact answer, trust me, we would, be tackling it immediately. But I think there are multiple answers, and perhaps one of these that I think is most significant is that extremist and conspiracy theories are creating sort of online environments that are compelling to people. They attempt to deny and minimize and distort facts around certainly this massacre and pretty much everything else. But there's the lack of facts that can be agreed upon in this country, but frankly globally, is something that we're still trying to deal with, right? I mean, this is beyond just sort of this particular conflict, but nobody believes in very much of anything anymore. There's no shame either, right? I mean, I know you and I have talked about this, that it's very hard to shame somebody to stop being an anti-Semite or an extremist of some sort. And so we find ourselves where that level of accountability sort of in the public is just not there anymore, because they're going to find other ways to spread their hatred and to gain audiences on various social media platforms. I think over time, it erodes sort of the fabric of our society. And I think that's why there's more sort of an openness and willingness to accept what used to be completely unacceptable. But, I sort of echo what Susan said. I don't think that puts us in a hopeless spot. I think what it provides is a clarity that we need to make sure that we are reaching people in the spaces in which they are getting access to their information. Provide them with alternatives, provide them with facts, and provide them with the ability to respond. Because I think we lose in the fight against anti-Semitism if we don't enable the supporters, people who want to combat it, with the tools that they need. And so as bad as it is online, perhaps it's also something that can be a solution.
Yeah, I appreciate your optimism there. And I share it. I mean, I don't think you can do this work if you don't see a path forward, but I know it feels dark to many of us right now, which is probably then a good segue, if I might. Thank you, Oren, for your thoughts. Over to you, David. You know, you're out there in Chicago, you're seeing what's happening in Wisconsin and Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, et cetera. And I know we literally talked about it earlier today, the situation on these college campuses and specifically the encampments. I think you tracked upwards of 24 encampments at different institutions across the Midwest, and you visited 11 or 12 of them. And I know you're now working with a number of university presidents in that area, like ADL is across the country. So I'm going to ask you a question that I often get asked with all that prelude. What feels different now over the past month on the campuses versus what you saw last spring? Or I should say, is it different? And if it is different, how so? And what do you think is driving that?
Yeah, look, I think it is different on campuses today. And in some places, it's better, I guess you could say, than it was in the spring. In other places, it's the same, or in some cases, even worse. We certainly don't have the intensity of the encampments that were occurring across the country and everything that came along with that, whether it be what we saw sort of on the evening news in places like in New York City and Los Angeles and in some parts of Chicago. But again, as I said, it's better in some cases and not as better, or should I say not better in other places. So for example, the attention has been caught, or I should say university leaders are certainly much more aware of what occurred on campus in the spring, and that it wasn't unique to their campus, but part of actually a national and international campaign. And they saw firsthand the anti-Semitism and hate that came and was born and fanned through these encampments. And so we saw over the summer, and a lot of universities acted as part of ADL's Not on My Campus campaign, where we outlined best practices on how you can address, whether it be your codes of conduct, the way you respond to incidents, the way you support students on campus. And some have embraced it. And they also saw, by the way, several university presidents being called before Congress and even state legislatures and having to answer questions about what they did and did not do. And so you have a lot of universities who have taken action internally. They've updated their codes of conduct. They've made them more specific. They have created new rules and guidelines for their faculty and educators in general, for student organizations. And they've run tabletops on what would happen if another encampment were to come. And so that has occurred. And in some cases, schools have done a pretty good job. But I was talking with someone recently on a campus, and it sort of reminded me of that quote of Mike Tyson, right? And I don't usually quote Mike Tyson, but he said, everyone has a plan to get punched in the face, right? And so what we've also seen is that as these codes of conduct have changed on campuses, students and student groups, particularly those anti-Israel student groups who helped organize what we saw in the spring, are really trying to push the envelope, and they're changing their tactics. Like at Indiana University in Bloomington, they prohibited protesting from 11 p.m. until 6 a.m., right? Every single night since school started, you have a student group that shows up to protest from 11 o'clock until 11:10 p.m. every night, trying to push the limit. Now, they've received citations and warnings, but again, you start seeing that. We've also seen on other campuses in Washington, D.C., in Maryland, in New York, and in the Midwest and Chicago, where I live, campuses and protests that have been emerging as well. And we saw a lot of them yesterday on October 7th, right? And so one law school in Chicago decided to have a day to recognize and commemorate Palestinian martyrdom yesterday. And by the way, like, they're talking about Hamas. And so in that particular case, things are more challenging. And I guess my last remark is that even with the development of these new codes of conduct, it's still going to come down to leadership. Are university leaders willing to do what is necessary to ensure that all of their students, Jewish students and across the board, not only feel safe on campus, but are actually safe on campus?
That's great, David. Well, I want to ask you, we talk about these campuses and the issues that are acute, the numbers are extraordinary, but what's happening off campuses in the Midwest? Like, what are you seeing happening in the city? Oren talked about the extremists that they're tracking online. Are you seeing certain groups as well doing it? Are you seeing a widespread movement? How would you characterize that?
Look, in Chicago, we have an incredibly organized and infrastructure of anti-Israel organizations who have been fanning the flames of hate and anti-Semitism long before October 7th, but especially since. And we have seen these groups organizing, showing up at city council meetings, targeting Jewish elected officials. We've had several Jewish elected officials in the Midwest who have had protests outside of their homes at 2, 3, 4 in the morning in residential neighborhoods. Last week, the state treasurer in Illinois, his home was targeted, and he was targeted at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning because the state of Illinois purchases Israel bonds, not recently, but did several years ago. And protesters not only woke up his twin 1-year-olds, but they vandalized their toys and painted them red to symbolize blood in their front yard. And so we see these groups becoming more brazen, more disgusting, more anti-Semitic, more hateful than perhaps we've ever seen. And so in many cases, we see they're emboldened. And kind of going back to the question you asked about college campuses, I mean, look, in Chicago, in a place, a large urban area, but not just Chicago, but any pretty much cities around the country. We see it in Omaha, we see it in Indianapolis, we see it in Minneapolis, St. Paul, we see it in Milwaukee. The encampments last spring, a small segment of those participating in those encampments were actually students, right? And if you walked around the encampment, as I did, you would see the stickers of groups and organizations that were active in the city, that were driving policy discussions or trying to drive policy discussions in the city council. They weren't student groups, but instead these students in many cases were being co-opted by these groups, and then university leadership was co-opted. And so off campus, we're seeing a major continuation of what we have seen since October 7th, whether it be anti-Israel protests, whether it be the burning of American flags. There was a protest off campus where a bloodied head of President Biden was held up, saying that through blood, Gaza will be redeemed, right? We still continue to see posters that call for the globalization of the Intifada. This is continuing in cities throughout the Midwest, and I hear from my colleagues around the country in their regions as well.
It's really pretty hideous. I got to ask, Susan, what David describing, is that what you'd say we're hearing about around the world and other diaspora communities as well? Is it campus incidents bleeding over and campuses having like non-students doing these protests? Similar phenomenon overseas versus domestically here in the United States?
So campuses are very different outside of the U.S. in most countries. We've actually seen that U.S. campuses have really inspired activism, anti-Israel activism and tactics on campuses in Europe and in the UK and elsewhere. There's a connectivity. They're sharing resources, they're sharing toolkits between the U.S., for example, and some very strident campus activism in Canada. And similarly, just as David described, there are networks, very strong networks of anti-Israel groups, hardened anti-Zionist groups that are in civil society, that are outside of campus, that are marching, that are mobilizing. You saw anti-Israel protests, for example, in London on Saturday, in which Hamas and Hezbollah were defended and celebrated and venerated. That's not necessarily campus focused. Those are wider community groups, and they're showing up in thousands to protests and continually mobilizing and sharing information and resources and tactics.
Wow, it's really quite astonishing. And I think hopefully we'll get into this a little bit more in the Q&A. Before we open it up, I just want to ask Eitan to come back to you. What Susan is describing here, which builds upon what David was talking about, are you seeing this as well? Are you seeing like this swarming effect when you come online? And I'd also like to ask, are you aware of other influencers like yourself having this similar phenomenon, Jewish influencers, sorry, of being swarmed and attacked in this way?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think, like a bunch of you have spoken about, there's been this kind of emboldening of people to openly support Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran, etc. I think one of the shifts I've seen is, whereas maybe there were anti-Israel sentiment or anti-Israel criticism or hate that could remotely some form of argument that it's just being critical or that it's remotely a fair type of criticism, that's kind of gone out the window. And I think even attempts by some of these bad actors to try to act like they're just legitimately criticizing Israel and legitimately criticizing Jews now feel like emboldened to just straight up support Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iran, and celebrate when 200 ballistic missiles were shot into mainland Israel. And so I think that's definitely something I've noticed. People are much more emboldened, and I think beyond that, across the board from other peers of mine, 100% across the board. I don't know almost any like outspokenly pro-Israel Jewish talent who does not have armed security, at least when they do public-facing events. At this point, the receiving death threats and requiring security is not the exception, but now the rule.
That's just horrible. Absolutely horrible. The idea that you have to bear that cost and you have to be responsible for it seems crazy to me, but I guess that's the world we're living in. Look, Deb, if you're with us, you do such a masterful job of the Q&A. Maybe you could take over from here so we can field questions from the audience.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm happy to. Eitan, we're going to start with you. The chat is absolutely popping with questions, and so this first one is for you. How do you see the social media platforms addressing 10/7 related anti-Semitism, and what changes would you like to see in how they handle the discussions related to this?
That is a very good question. I think that's evolved quite a bit. I wrote and then had the backing of 100+ other Jewish talent on social media, a letter that was written to TikTok called Dear TikTok, which called out the rampant anti-Semitism on TikTok and complete either deterioration of moderation systems or lack thereof to protect the Jewish community on TikTok. I had peers of mine who there were videos made openly calling for the death of them, of individual Jewish content creators. I'd say across the board, platforms have gotten better. I try behind the scenes to, advise people that I know who work on these platforms and friends of mine and people that I've been connected with to do what I can to show them the problems that they might not see themselves. I definitely think, at least over the course of the year, there have been times when it's been top of mind for all the platforms. I think they know about it, but I think unfortunately, because of many U.S. laws, they're not liable for, I believe it's Title 13. I forgot I'm blanking on the exact name, but there's U.S. law that makes these platforms not not legally liable for the content on them. So there's almost no legal or financial incentive for these companies to do that much, which is unfortunate.
It's extremely unfortunate. As a follow-up to that question, Oren, I think this might be for you. Can you speak a little to what ADL is doing to fight anti-Semitism on social media? It seems as if our educational presence there is intensified. Is that part of our strategy?
Yeah, I mean, in order to combat it, you really have to understand it really well. So as an example, a new piece that we just published looks at an analysis of Telegram in particular, which is a particular cesspool for anti-Semitism and hate and extremism, and looking to assess the influence of the October 7th massacre on the level of violent anti-Semitism and in the days, weeks, and months since the attack. We continuously monitor multiple different platforms. Our analysts and researchers spent a lot of time doing qualitative, quantitative machine learning techniques in order to understand kind of the volume and the reach. And we found that, again, there was a 433% increase in violent online anti-Semitism, meaning threats, etc., targeting people because of their identity on just that one platform. So the question is, to your point, like, A, we have to understand what it actually is happening on these platforms. The second part is, what do we do about it, right? So, with some people who are, I guess, good actors, the information that we have on what extremists talk about, the code words they use, the symbols, etc., may use that, implement that, train their own algorithms to get ahead of and identify anti-Semitism and hate on their platform and to try to minimize that. Then there are other platforms like Telegram that I just mentioned that have shown zero indication that they want to stop the sort of exploitation of their platforms by those sorts of, actors. And so exposing what we are seeing is critical. Where we can work with companies and provide them with our insights so that they, as ADL said multiple times, put people over profits, that's important. But I think our fundamental role is to make sure that we are providing information on what is happening there, and then using our connections, and our voice to expect more from these companies. It's not unreasonable for people to expect that the platforms that are making billions of dollars do more, and we are here to help them if they want it.
Thank you for that, Oren. Susan, this next question is for you. Have you seen anything from your interactions with global Jewish communities that is inspiring to you?
So, Deb, I think that's a really important question because we're talking about a lot of very dark trends here, and I don't want to minimize that. But I spoke earlier about the resiliency and the vibrancy and determination that we see from Jewish communities around the world. Really, whether they're large communities or small communities, whatever challenges, we're seeing so many signs that they're standing up, they're pushing back against hate, and they're doing what they can. Just in the last 48 hours, for example, we saw communities coming together from London and Paris to Sydney, to Buenos Aires, to Toronto, to Johannesburg, tens of thousands of Jews standing up to remember the victims of October 7th, to advocate for the hostages, and to stand up against anti-Semitism. I even heard this morning that the small community of Malmö, Sweden, had 300 people come together for their event last night. Super inspiring. The other thing that I think has been really important has been how Jewish communities around the world are working together. At ADL, we see this most with the J7 Task Force Against Anti-Semitism, which is comprised of the 7 largest Jewish diaspora communities around the world, where we meet 2 times a month. We meet in person throughout the year, and we're in regular touch, sharing trends, sharing observations. If this is happening in Canada, it might be happening in Australia. If this is happening in London, in the UK, it might be coming to the US, and vice versa. And we're sharing these trends, our analysis, and also best practices. And we really it's really a global response to anti-Semitism and a global response to how do we build up Jewish resiliency. And I'm very inspired by those two things.
Thank you for that, Susan. I appreciate hearing that from you. Anything that feels inspirational is certainly welcome in this moment. Let's see. David, I feel like this is a great question for you. How can folks at home get the government to support the fight of anti-Semitism in their state? What are you doing in Illinois?
Absolutely. Look, we're doing several things, not just in Illinois, but around the entire Midwest. So there are several things. Number one, we've been working really closely, whether it be with governors or attorneys general or legislatures, to develop statewide anti-Semitism plans. And what that means is looking at the beginning, how are they defining anti-Semitism, encouraging states to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. What are they doing around training for law enforcement and for state employees? Is anti-Semitism included in it? Are hate crimes training included in it? What are we doing around teaching anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in K through 12 schools? We've developed these best practices, shall we say, or steps that states can take that we want to encourage them to create safe states and active and aggressive and proactive states in combating anti-Semitism. And so if somebody's looking for something to do, I would encourage them first to engage with their local ADL office and figure out how they can be involved and take part in our advocacy activities. We are active in dozens of states across the country, as well as local units of government and, of course, Congress. And so there's opportunities to engage with elected officials and administrators to talk about this. Administrations, to talk about these types of things. And then the second thing is people certainly can go to ADL's website and take a look at our Take Action page. There's a lot of things that you can do to engage your local elected officials to talk about this. And then the last piece, what I would say is get to know your local elected officials and make it clear to them that they know that they're members of the Jewish community who are concerned about anti-Semitism, that live in their district, that vote for them, and that are watching what they are doing as it relates to combating anti-Semitism and hate more broadly.
Thank you for that, David. So, Jonathan, we don't have a ton of time left, but I have two things that are for you. The first is we're seeing a lot of, that's putting it mildly, misinformation and disinformation through the media. What are your thoughts on what we can do to help stop that?
So I think it's a good question, and I think I go back to what Oren said at the top. I mean, more people are getting their news today, young people particularly, from TikTok versus from the Times. And I think at the end of the day, you can't whack-a-mole and find every bad post. We've got to encourage the platforms to change. We've got to update the rules of the road. I mean, in its simplest form, you should be liable if you print libel. You should be responsible if you're publishing irresponsible propaganda. So I believe in legislative reform, ideally targeting Section 230 of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. That would once and for all make the online media companies as responsible for what they print or publish as the traditional media companies, as the broadcast media companies, as the newsprint media companies, and so on. Just make them liable. I understand it's an excuse with no limit, but so was the color television at its time, if you will. There's no reason why they can't figure this out and apply a little bit of common sense to it.
So before we let you go, Jonathan, and I know I love to put you on the spot, but can you share with us something that gives you hope? It's a dark couple of days, especially this week. What's given you hope? 1,000-some
people on this webinar today gives me hope. I mean, as terrible as the situation has been, and it's been bad, I think it has proven the resilience of not just the people of Israel, but the Israeli people. As hard as it's been to find allies, so many people have shown up without even being asked and stood with the Jewish community. As difficult as it's been on these campuses, the level of engagement and the energy around these Jewish students is remarkable. The ones fighting back, I say this as father of 2 kids in college, I see it firsthand. So this is a trying time. But I think it's awoken the lion. And you're seeing the way Israel is taking out the leadership of Hezbollah and taking out the leadership of Hamas. And look, every civilian casualty is a tragedy, and I'm not excusing or rationalizing any of it. But what they're doing to decapitate these terror movements is important. And we have the power here to take action as well. Now, of course, not like the IDF does, but we have the power to use Jewish pride, to use Jewish self-confidence, to use Jewish capabilities to call out the misinformation, to expose the extremists, to try to get this right. And I'm seeing people of all walks of life, of all ages, across all ends of the political spectrum, speaking up, sharing facts, and showing strength. And that gives me tremendous, tremendous hope.
I always feel just a little better after hearing you answer that question, so thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time for Q&A, but I do want to thank you, Jonathan and Eitan, Susan, Oren, and David for joining us today and sharing all of your insights and for answering those questions. Anti-Semitism is on the rise, and we need your voice. Join ADL in urging governors to lead the fight with strong statewide strategies to combat anti-Semitism that unite schools, government agencies, businesses, and law enforcement. Text governor to 26769, or you can use the link that should be in the chat right now. And if you witness or experience an anti-Semitic incident, please report it to ADL. That link will also be included in the chat. We'd like to share a reflection before we close. We will never forget the lives lost on October 7th, 2023. For the families of those murdered and kidnapped, it is still October 7th, 2023. They've spent every minute of the past year fighting to bring their loved ones home. We're here to tell them they are not alone. Thank you to those who have spoken out for victims, the hostages, and for their families. Every voice matters. We're going to leave you with a video, and we encourage you to share it and share it broadly and widely. The link for it will also be in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us today.
366 days.
52 weeks.
12 months.
And 1 year.
It's been 1 year since Hamas terrorists invaded Israel to slaughter, rape, mutilate, and kidnap men, women, children, and the elderly,
including Holocaust survivors and people of all different religions and nationalities.
Over 1,200 people were murdered.
251 people brutally kidnapped.
101 people remain in Hamas captivity.
Today may be October 7, 2024.
But for the families of the hostages, it's still October 7th, 2023.
They are still living in a nightmare that has been their reality for an entire year.
They've spent 1 year not knowing the fate of their loved ones.
Mothers, fathers, grandparents, siblings, and children.
Are they alive?
Will you ever see them again?
The one thing you do know is this.
1 year ago, they were kidnapped by terrorists who proudly recorded their brutal massacre of Israeli citizens for the world to see.
Yet people around the world continue to ignore, diminish, or attempt to justify the atrocities that took place.
While some celebrate the violence and terror.
All the while, families have spent every minute of the last 366 days.
52 weeks.
12 months.
1 year.
Fighting to bring them all